Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 112. Before we get into today's questions, a big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration. Precision Hydration create electrolyte products that you can match to your individual sweat rate and sweat sodium content, so that you can adequately replace the sodium that you lose for your sweat, whether you are a high sodium sweater or a low sodium sweater. You can take a free online sweat test on their website, and that will give you a good ballpark estimate for how much you lose and therefore how much you should replace. Now that we are heading into the indoor training season, where you might sweat quite profusely depending on your level of ventilation that you have, it might be a really good time to experiment a bit with electrolytes and thinking about how you should replace them to optimize training performance. You can get 15% off your order with the promo code THATTriathlonshow15 on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka are the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses. And they are currently running holiday sales, so you can get up to 50% off of select products, and this sale will last until December 1st. If there are products that are not on sale, definitely go to roka.com/TTS, and they will give you 20% off any products that are on regular pricing. Of course, if you are getting products that are on sale, it would be massively appreciated if you could contact Roka through some of their channels, whether it's email or social media, and let them know that you came from That Triathlon Show so that they can keep knowing that they get a positive ROI on their sponsorship, which is very important for the sustainability of this podcast. Also, I want to quickly mention that we still have some slots left for the training camp that we're having on the 10th to 17th of April on Mallorca, a scientific triathlon training camp for our athletes, but also for podcast listeners. So there are some slots left. Go to scientifictriathlon.com/camp to learn more, see all the details. Email me if you want further information, and send in your application on that web page and to secure your slot on the camp. Now let's get into today's questions, which are from Sondre in Norway, who writes, "Hi Michael, and thank you for a great podcast. My first question is how to make good decisions in changing your training for the next training block based on your performance testing. Let's say you do some initial testing, whether it's an FTP test, a 5-kilometer run time trial, or a CSS test in swimming, and so on. And then you go and train for a block of training and you retest 8 weeks later. If you perform better, should you continue with the same training? What about if you perform the same or worse? Should you change the training? What are some guidelines, questions to ask yourself on how to change training if that case? Let's assume that external factors such as sleep, nutrition, stress from work, and so on are all optimized for training and stay constant." So this is a really good question. Thank you for sending it in. There are different ways of approaching this. So what I'll share here is what I do in my coaching. And it starts with always having a periodization plan for all my athletes, where I have outlined what I think they will be focusing on each training block or training week over the course of the year. And I say that what I think, because this is what I plan at the outset, but then we get more information, we get more data, we get a view into how the athlete responds, and then some things change, some things don't change. But the initial periodization plan will almost never be followed 100%, but it's still important to have that plan. So when I have athletes do testing in the way you describe, typically that testing would happen at the end of a particular training block. And in the periodization plan that I have for them, I will already have planned to change the training focus in some way after the testing for this reason, because I just tend to like the timing of having the tests in the last week of a block. It's not always the case, but it's often the case. So as an example, maybe the athlete does testing after an initial block focusing primarily on aerobic endurance. And then the next block that I have planned has an emphasis on including more moderate or high intensity training. So that's the initial plan. And even before the athlete does the test, we have like a direction that is what we're planning on doing. So then the question for me isn't whether the athlete should keep doing the same training or do something different, but rather the question really is, should we stick to the plan or should we change the plan? And I do think that having this kind of long-term plan is really important. Of course, it shouldn't get too rigid. You need to be prepared to look at the evidence of the athlete's progress and change the plan accordingly, or tweak it, or just slightly update it as and when needed. That's something that is done on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. But still, I think that long-term plan is quite essential for optimal training. So if we look at the two scenarios with this background in mind, knowing that we already have a plan in place. First, the athlete did perform better in the new test, the recent test, compared to the previous test 8 weeks earlier. More often than not, this means simply stick to the plan that you already have in place. But it also depends a bit on what testing methodology you're using. So if the athlete is doing one of the tests that you mentioned, which are pure field tests, so by that I mean you don't measure lactate or VO2 or anything like that, you just measure performance, like the power over 20 minutes or the speed over 5 kilometers or time for 5 kilometers, then usually it's pretty simple. You keep following the plan if you saw an improvement in the performance. And again, that might still mean that the training changes, but it changes according to what you had already planned to do. There might be some exceptions where you have strong reasons to change it, but that would probably not be related to the test itself, but more so how the athlete has reacted over the course of the training period. However, if you are using some testing method that gives you, that is more metabolic, for example, you get some information about the underlying mechanisms of improvement, such as, for example, an insight test, a lactate test, or a gas exchange test, then what you find about how those improvements happened may cause you to rethink what your plan was. So, for example, if you find that your improvement in the test came from mostly an improvement in anaerobic capacity, then maybe you would change the plan. Maybe you had planned to do a block of high-intensity interval training, with that being something that was of primary focus, but with the knowledge that you saw a big increase in anaerobic capacity from over the previous block, then maybe doing more high-intensity intervals is not the right way to go. So you might want to change your plan and focus more on purely aerobic training. So that would be an example of how, depending on the testing methodology, the outcome might be different. The second scenario, if you perform worse in the second test than you did 8 weeks previous, here again, there is an advantage of using more sophisticated tests than field tests and looking under the hood, getting an idea of why you performed worse. And if the reason that you performed worse is actually aligned with the training that you did and the plan you have going forward, then you might still proceed with the plan just the way you did. It might be unexpected performance decrease or not improvement in the test, but because you're working on something that, for whatever reason, will have better sort of medium to long-term effects. So that could be one example. And for example, this might happen if you're really focusing purely on the aerobic endurance side of things. You might not see great improvements initially over that 8-week block in a CSS test on the swim, for example, because it's very high intensity, it's very short, and the same sort of thing depending on what testing methodology you use on the bike and the run. But it might still be the best way to go, and you might know that, okay, maybe we didn't see that improvement in performance, but we perhaps, with another testing methodology, with an insight test, with a lactate test, we saw that the underlying mechanisms are positive and it's going in the direction we wanted. That means that you just stick to the plan. You don't need to change it. But in some other situations, maybe you do see that, the mechanisms underlying the not improving weren't exactly what you expected. So maybe that will cause you to change the plan. If, on the other hand, you use one of the field tests you mentioned and you only have the actual performance in the test to guide you, then you simply need to conduct an analysis for why you didn't improve without having access to any of this physiological test data. If we assume, as you say, that everything around training was constant, nutrition, work, sleep, etc., we only need to think about what happened training-wise. Then the primary things to look at would include your training volume, your training intensity distribution, and what your key workouts actually looked like compared to the period before your previous test. You should also assess how you actually felt in the workouts and use all of this information to make a hypothesis for why you did not improve. For example, did you feel strong when doing extended moderate intensity work, but felt that you didn't really have anything when it came to top end work, really high intensity work, or the other way around, or something else entirely? This kind of assessment can give you some indications, at least some guesses as for the underlying mechanism behind you're not improving. And this should, as I said, be combined with the actual training analysis. So numbers such as training volume, training intensity, and the content of key workouts. For example, how much time did you spend in the zone 5 in a VO2 max workout? How much time in zone 4 in threshold workout, and so on. And those knowledge of those things can strengthen or weaken your hypothesis. So then, once you have your best, most likely hypothesis clear in your own mind, you should ask yourself, was this me not improving an acceptable result given the focus of the training block? So again, we can come back to that same example. Maybe you are naturally a very anaerobic athlete, and the focus of your training block was to improve the aerobic side. And maybe you did improve your aerobic side, but you might have weakened your anaerobic engine. So the net effect was a wash in a 20-minute bike test or a 5-kilometer run test or a CSS test in the pool. But that might be perfectly fine if you're a triathlete. That might be like exactly what you were after, because aerobic capacity is what you need to focus on and not anaerobic capacity. So, or perhaps, let's say you did a block very focused on one discipline, on swimming. So your bike and run volume simply wasn't high enough for them to improve, but maybe your swim improved a lot. And in both of these cases, even though the performance in the test didn't improve, you could still say that you achieved the overall objectives you targeted of that previous block and it was successful. So maybe the best thing to do is to just go ahead and keep following the plan you had in these situations. So to summarize, there's not really a clear if this then that answer, but when you test, you always, even when you improve, want to figure out why that happened, what was the mechanism behind the improvement and or not improvement, and simply use that as input information when asking yourself whether the plan you have in place still is the best path going forward, given the new information that you now have. All right, so Sondre's second question is the theory and application of moderate intensity training for swimming, biking, and running. A, what is the definition of moderate intensity? What is the difference, if any, between zone 3, tempo, moderate intensity training, LT1, RPE 4 to 6, etc.? All right, so this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's really good that you ask, because for newer listeners and more beginner athletes especially, it can be very confusing. So we have a lot of terms here to cover. Low intensity training, moderate intensity training, and high intensity training is a way to describe, to split training intensities into 3 different domains. And this is used quite often, for example, in the polarized training research papers or training intensity distribution research papers. We can have this terminology used. And the demarcation points between the low and the moderate intensity training zones there would be LT1 or VT1, and that stands for the first lactate threshold or the first ventilatory threshold. And they are not the same, but they are usually very similar. The difference is that the first one comes from an assessment based on lactate, and the second, the ventilatory threshold, comes from an assessment based on a gas exchange test. And then the demarcation point between the moderate and the high intensity training zones there would be correspondingly LT2 or VT2, so the second lactate and ventilatory thresholds. And corresponding to LT2 and VT2, again, not being the exact same, but trying to estimate the same kind of transition point, more or less, would be terms such as functional threshold power, or critical power, or maximum lactate steady state. So if we go, the abbreviations would be FTP or CP or MLSS. And in some of the scientific literature, for example, the polarized training literature, but also in some coaching methodologies, typically they might use a 3-zone system. So zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3 would be the 3 training zones. And zone 1 would be the low intensity training zone, and zone 2, the moderate intensity zone, and zone 3, the high intensity zone. But this is a very important point. You can never know for sure when a person says, like talking about zone 2, for example, whether what zonal system that person is referring to. Are they talking about a 3-zone model or a 5-zone model or something else? So you should never assume, and the person talking about zones should always define their zones because there are so many different ones out there. It is likely, I would say, that most people talk about a 5-zone system, where if we describe the 5 zones qualitatively, zone 1 would be recovery or very easy training, zone 2 would be endurance or steady training, zone 3 would be tempo or moderate training. In running terms, we could talk about marathon pace when it comes to zone 3. Zone 4 would be threshold. So for runners, again, we could, as an example, say half marathon to 15K or 10-mile pace for faster runners, and for slow runners, maybe around 10-kilometer pace for zone 4. And some systems have zone 4 end right at your second threshold, your anaerobic threshold. But in some systems, it goes a bit above threshold. Frankly, I don't think that it really makes that much of a difference whether it goes a little bit above or it ends right at threshold, but that is a difference that you need to be aware of, that when somebody talks about zone 4, it might be at most threshold, but when somebody else talks about zone 4, it might be possible that they're actually training slightly above threshold. Either way, zone 5 is, you could describe as maximum aerobic capacity, which would be between 10K and mile pace for fast runners, or between 5K to mile pace for slower runners, very roughly speaking again. But then to make things even more confusing, and this is something that we've had in a couple of recent episodes, interviews on that triathlon show, is that in some other scientific literature, we don't refer to the training zones or training domains by low intensity, moderate intensity, and high intensity, but we actually refer to the training domains. And this is typical in, for example, research about critical power. It comes to mind. This is something that we talked about with Mark Burnley quite a bit. And when we're talking about the training domains here in this context, we have the moderate domain, the heavy domain, the severe domain, and the extreme domain. And the moderate, heavy, and severe would correspond to the low, moderate, and high intensity. So moderate intensity training is not the same as training in the moderate domain, because low intensity training is the same as training in the moderate domain. And that is, again, something that is a bit unfortunate, that there are so many different confusing terminologies to keep track of, but that's just the way it is. But this system with the domains is really mostly used in the scientific literature, but you will hear people on in the interviews on that triathlon show talk about this. So you need to be aware of the differences here between the moderate domain, which is low intensity training, and moderate intensity training, which is the heavy domain, whereas high intensity training is the severe domain, and the extreme domain is when you go above your VO2 max, so basically above high intensity training. What's good for listeners of this podcast is that, personally at least, I try to be pretty consistent in my use of terminology. When I talk about zones, I talk about a 5-zone model, unless otherwise specified. And I like to talk about low intensity training, moderate intensity training, and high intensity training that are demarcated by LT1 and LT2, or correspondingly the aerobic and anaerobic threshold. So LT1 would be the aerobic threshold, and LT2 the anaerobic threshold. So I don't really talk about the moderate domain or the heavy domain, and I also don't talk about a 3-zone system with zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. I talk about a 5-zone system with zones up to zone 5, even zone 6 when you go above the VO2 max. So tempo is another term that you ask about, and that is a label that has been given to zone 3 training in the very popular training system by Andy Coggan for cycling. I believe at least that this is where it first came to prominence, really, when, at least in terms of using tempo as a label for moderate intensity training, because tempo training has been in existence in running terminology for a much longer time, I believe. But when runners talk about doing tempo runs, they're actually often referring to runs that are at what would be around their threshold intensity. And they're absolutely not wrong in doing this because, again, they're probably the first ones to use this term. But among triathletes, the Kogan zones are so well established that when I talk about tempo training, whether it's running, cycling, or swimming, it is that training in zone 3. So from above LT1 to a bit below LT2. And then you ask about RPE and RPE 4-6. So I generally advise that a workout right around LT1, so the high end of zone 2, should feel like a 5 out of 10. But as you get into the mid to high end of zone 3, then your RPE would be more like a 6, maybe even a 7 at the high end of zone 3. That would be my advice. So your 4-6 is a bit on the low end. Like 4 would definitely, to me, be a zone 2 workout. 5 would also be like the very high end of zone 2, which is in essence the same as the low end of zone 3. So you could argue that 5 would also be part of your moderate intensity training. Depends on how you skew it, and it really doesn't matter. But when I prescribe training in zone 3, I would expect that RPE would be generally, let's call it 6 out of 10, would be my standard. And then it could go up to 7. So hope that this clarifies some of the definitions and the terms, and that we are now all on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about moderate intensity training. Then question B from Sonde is, what are the physiological benefits of doing moderate intensity? So the first one that I would say is that, first let's cover a little bit about muscle fibers, just briefly. We have different types of muscle fibers, slow twitch or type 1 muscle fibers, and fast twitch that we have that are type 2 muscle fibers, but we have both 2A fibers that can work in a combination of anaerobic and the aerobic metabolism, and then 2X that are very much anaerobic fibers with very limited capacity to work aerobically. And one particular benefit of moderate intensity training is that it makes the type 2A fibers more effective at producing energy aerobically. So they become less anaerobic, more aerobically dominant, and get more resistant to fatigue. They can work for longer that way. So that is a key advantage of moderate intensity training, be able to utilize more of your 2A fibers for aerobic energy production, and they will be able to do that for longer when you train them and they get more resistant to fatigue. A second key benefit is, not physiological per se, but specificity. I'm not going to elaborate too much, but no matter what racing you're doing, a certain amount of specific training is important to maximize performance. Coaches, of course, differ in just how much specific training is deemed the right dose and how much focus is placed on it. But I don't think there are any coaches that would argue against the importance of having some specificity in their training. And since moderate intensity is race pace at, for example, the Olympic distance and the half-distance triathlon, even full-distance triathlon, if you're a faster athlete, then this aspect of getting specific training done is another key benefit of moderate intensity training. And then potentially working on your economy around race pace. I should say here that I'm actually really not sure if there is strong evidence that your economy improves more effectively at the paces that you actually train at. But anecdotally, I would say that this is a potential benefit, that when you are doing more training around whatever intensity you're working at, then you get like an economy boost around that intensity. So this is something that is a bit more speculative on my part, but I think that is one of the reasons that specificity is important, potentially at least. Question C is, who should be doing moderate intensity work? Sprint distance athletes, Ironman athletes, beginners, professionals, and so on. So if you're targeting events that fall into the moderate intensity bucket, so as I mentioned, Olympic distance, half distance, maybe Ironman distance, depending on your level, then you should definitely be doing a fair amount of it, in my opinion. That means, anybody focusing on Olympic and half distance triathlon should definitely be doing a fair amount of it. Advanced athletes focusing on the full distance should also be doing it. Maybe if you're a true beginner, then you don't need to focus as much on it, even if you're targeting the Olympic and half distance events, because you might actually be going slower than moderate. Well, definitely for the half distance, you would be going at the low intensity domain, most likely. And the Olympic distance, you might be doing that as well. So for beginners, maybe you don't need as much of a focus on moderate intensity training. But generally speaking, for most athletes, those events all indicate that you should have some specific focus on it. In running, if you're a slower runner, then in particular, if you're focusing on the 10K and the half marathon distances, then moderate intensity training becomes a focus. And for faster runners, moderate intensity training is a focus if you're targeting half marathon to marathon distances. To some extent, though, even regardless of your race focus, I think every triathlete should be doing at least some moderate intensity training. If nothing else, because I do believe that over the course of a training year, you should not completely neglect any given intensity range, because you can get those low-hanging fruit by doing something of everything, so to say. But more importantly, I think there are specific physiological benefits far beyond just race specificity. So I mentioned, again, for example, that the fact that you can get your 2A fibers to be more fatigue resistant and be more aerobic. And even for a sprint distance athlete, even though they may not be racing in the moderate intensity zone, at least if you're a fast athlete, you'll be in the high intensity zone. But there are still benefits to be had in being able to make those 2A fibers more oxidative and fatigue resistant, because you will be going for 50 minutes, 60 minutes. So it's still highly beneficial. It's still a long endurance event. There are not that many endurance events that are as long as 50 to 60 minutes, which a sprint triathlon is. On the extreme side of things, though, I should say that if you're a rower, that you're racing in events lasting 6 minutes, then I think that moderate intensity training has much less value and would be a very small part of your training. Question D is, when in the season should moderate intensity training be done and how frequently? So this you could slice and dice in many different ways. With advanced athletes, I like to work in kind of like a block periodized manner. So when we do moderate intensity training, we might do blocks of it lasting anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6 weeks. And of course, alongside that training, we have ever-present low-intensity training, endurance training. But in those blocks, the key sessions will be the moderate intensity sessions, and we would do them quite frequently, a lot of them within a block. So in early blocks and in the early part of the season, and again, this is how I coach. This is not like the one and only answer, but this is just to describe my model. In early blocks of the season, like right now in November, the blocks would be shorter. We could, for example, do a 2-week block with a focus on moderate intensity training. But later on, as we get closer and closer to races, they will get longer because moderate intensity training will become relatively more important, because that is where almost all of my athletes will be racing, given their abilities and their race distances. Assuming that the athlete is training every day, then, and even multiple times per day on certain days, then early in the season, you might be doing, that would be now, for example, you might be doing 3 moderate intensity workouts, 1 per discipline, for example. And the balance would be a lot of aerobic work, low intensity work. But later on, as you get into the race specific phase, you might be doing 5 or 6 moderate intensity workouts per week. But remember that there should always be enough room for, first of all, rest and recuperation, so that you can not only do the training, but recover from it and adapt to it. But also, you should never completely neglect the low intensity training, the endurance training. It always needs to be there. So the athlete's training volume and their ability to recover from the training really determines how much you should be doing, but it might be, as I said, up to 5 to 6 times per week. For more beginner athletes, I think there is a case for having a periodization that is more of what you might call a daily undulating periodization, which ensures that you do a little bit of moderate intensity training every week and a little bit of high intensity every week, and a fair amount of low intensity training, of course. So it might look like doing one moderate intensity workout and one high intensity workout per week, and the rest of it endurance. And that would be at least in the early part of the season. And you could alternate in which disciplines you do what. So in the moderate versus high intensity training from week to week, assuming you're a triathlete, of course. If you're a runner, for example, then the classic one tempo run and a true tempo run here, like a zone 3 run, and one interval run, and then the rest endurance would be a great example for the more beginner athletes, because that just keeps that, the daily undulating periodization makes sure that you get a little bit of a stimulus of everything, and a little bit of a stimulus is usually enough when you're a more beginner athlete versus a very experienced athlete that might need a bit of more of a shock to the system to improve, which is why block periodization would be my preference for them. Question E is, when in relation to other high intensity sessions should moderate intensity work be done? Should it be the day before, the day after, or the same day, or what do you think? So if I include both high intensity and moderate intensity training in the same training block, I also always want the high intensity training to be done when you're the freshest. And for the moderate intensity training, it depends on how hard that workout is and how important it is. If it is a very challenging and important key workout, then you definitely want to have a day of lighter training before that workout as well. But if it's not the hardest, then it can be done the day after a high intensity training session. And it is even possible to do them on the same day in that case, but then the moderate intensity session shouldn't be all that challenging, really. And I also recommend that if you do that one of the workouts should be a swim. So that you would, for example, do a high intensity swim in the morning and a moderate intensity bike in the afternoon or evening, rather than do a bike and run, because then you're using so similar muscle groups a lot in the lower body, and you might be very depleted and not ready to do the second workout at the level that you should be doing it. But generally speaking, it depends on how fresh you need to be and how important the workout is. If you need to be fresh for that moderate intensity workout, then you should be rested for it. Take an easier day before that. But you should always be fresh for the high intensity training, because that's how you will really benefit from the high intensity training. Don't do that when you're experiencing any sort of significant fatigue. Question F is, what are some common mistakes of planning and executing moderate intensity sessions? So I would say that there are two that are far more common than any other. And number one is going too hard, and number two is not going long enough. I think it's very typical to go too hard but not go long enough, and think that, well, that is a good session because it got you very tired. But what would have given you the better possibility of adaptation is to have gone slightly easier, but to have gone longer. The very typical example here will be a 20-minute tempo run, which, again, because as I mentioned, tempo run for runners is usually something around threshold, and it might even be a bit faster. So if you're a reasonably experienced athlete and you want to move the needle with your threshold, with your LT2 or your anaerobic threshold, then I think that you just need way more dosage than just 20 minutes of work. I would say at least 30 up to 40 minutes. So a better workout would be to do 4 to 5 times 8 minutes with 2 to 4 minute recoveries. That would be a perfect workout. A lot of runners that do a 20-minute tempo run, they do it at kind of a 95% effort. So it's not quite all out, but it's not that far off. And they simply can't imagine going any longer than 20 minutes because, you're knackered after that. And the reason for that is that you're running actually right at threshold or slightly above threshold even. And that means that you have to sacrifice duration for the intensity. And it would be better to do that 4 or 5 times 8 minutes and go a bit below threshold. Let's say your threshold is 4 minutes per kilometer. There's nothing wrong with doing your threshold training in that case at between 4:05 and 4:10 per kilometer. So that would be your target pace, and you would do 4 to 5 times 8 minutes of that and get a stronger duration stimulus, even if your intensity is slightly lower. Whereas the alternative for that athlete might be that they actually go and run at 355 for 20 minutes or even 350 for 20 minutes. It is something that I see quite commonly. And there are, of course, countless examples of this in triathlon as well. And when these mistakes occur, the workout simply fails to hit the mark. Remember that duration is very often trumps intensity. There are maybe some exceptions to that, but in many cases, I think this is not just a problem with moderate intensity sessions, but with many types of sessions. And question G, what are some examples of good classic moderate intensity workouts for swimming, biking, and running? All right, so please keep in mind that these workouts can and should be scaled according to ability level. But yeah, here you go. These are just examples, of course. For the swim, a good classic moderate intensity workout would be 6 to 8 times 400 meters at a pace that would be maybe 4 or 5 seconds per 100 slower than your CSS. So if your CSS is 130, you might be swimming at 135 pace per 100 meter. And recoveries might be anywhere from 20 seconds to 1 minute. I wouldn't be afraid in swimming to have slightly longer recoveries than what is conventional, because I think that quite often the conventional recoveries are too short. But maybe a typical recovery for 400 meters, I might give 40 seconds. So that would be a simple example. For the bike, a typical classic session would be 2 times 30 minutes at 85% of FTP with 5 minutes recovery. And depending on the objective of the session, there might also be some cadence specifications, some low cadence, maybe some high cadence. So that could be included as well. But the basic recipe is pretty simple. And similarly for the run, maybe 2 times 30 minutes is quite a lot. Definitely for a marathon runner, it would absolutely be done. But for a triathlete, maybe focusing on the half distance or so, then a great workout would be to do 2 times 25 minutes at marathon pace or slightly faster. So let's say you can do a marathon in 4 minutes, 20 seconds per kilometer, then you would do 2 times 25 minutes at that pace, and you might take 5 minutes recovery between those reps, and you would even choose a rolling route to get some different stimuli in terms of like going uphill and downhill and learning how to run both uphill and downhill effectively as well. So those would be great examples of moderate intensity workouts on swimming, biking, and running. Then Sondre has a third question, which is essentially the same questions that we discussed here for moderate intensity training, but related to threshold intervals. So we will actually tackle that because that too is very much worth discussing, but this episode is getting long, so we'll discuss that on next week's Q&A. So that's it for today. Please go to scientifictriathlon.com and check out our training camp, the 10th to 17th of April on Mallorca. Fill out the application there, and I hope to see you next April. Also, of course, you can check out our information about coaching and training plans and so on, if that's something that you're interested in. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and get a free hydration plan and get 15% off your order of electrolytes with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear. Remember that their holiday sales are now on, so it's worth going and getting up to 50% off on some products. If there are any products that you're looking for that are not on sale, then you can get 20% off of them anyway with a special coupon code for That Triathlon Show listeners that you can find on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.